Her name was Celine Var, and she had always believed in the beauty of small things, glass petals, quiet corners, whispered kindness. Her world was composed of curves and light, art poured into fragments of color on translucent panes. She worked with heat and vision, coaxing life into something as fragile as memory. The morning she was taken, she had just finished laying a final gold trim over a lotus-shaped panel meant for a greenhouse in a nearby coastal city. Her hands still smelled faintly of resin and ash. Her window was open. Her son, Kais, was brushing his teeth and humming a tune about frogs. Outside, the light was soft, the kind of light that made even ugly truths look gentle. They arrived without sound. 3 officers in dull gray uniforms, speaking in clipped tones. Celine didn't resist when they read her the charge. She only blinked, once, when they said the word murder. A neighbor's body had been found at the edge of the canal near the ruins. Blood loss, laceration. A piece of her stained glass had been found nearby. They called it motive, jealousy. They said she'd applied for the same grant, an art restoration fund. The neighbor had one. Celine said nothing. Not because she had no words, but because she knew the wrong ones could be fatal. The moment they locked her wrists, she realized the system didn't want truth. It wanted resolution. And quickly. Nickon Travers had been assigned as a state translator not by choice, but by circumstance. Years ago, he'd been a field linguist studying dialectic bleed in fringe communities, especially where human settlers coexisted with older-rooted cultures. He'd fallen in love with language before he understood what it could be used to destroy. Now, he translated for the court, where words were weapons or walls. Celine Var spoke a hybrid dialect of Syrian Riven, a flowing language laced with botanical metaphors and sensory-rooted phrases. When frightened, she reverted to it, and few understood it well enough to follow. Except Nickon. The first time he saw her, she was seated in a room too white to breathe in. Cuffs on her wrists, but her posture serene. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't begging. Her silence was louder than anything the state could play on repeat. She refuses to cooperate, said the attorney beside Nickon, tossing him a stack of transcripts. Don't sympathize. Just translate. But something about her eyes, dark like lakewater in autumn, caught in Nickon like a splinter. He read the transcripts that night. And then he reread them. The trial was scheduled to last 4 days. On the second day, Celine spoke. Not to the jury, not to the judge. Only to Nickon. Her voice, hushed and low, reached him through the glass wall of the interpreter's booth. She asked a question in Syrian Riven. Do you believe in the color blue? Nickon paused. Yes, he answered softly, also in Syrian. Then you believe in things you cannot hold. She turned back toward the front, and did not speak again. He began comparing the original recordings to the official transcripts. Something didn't align. Her words were often reinterpreted, curt, shortened, warped. A statement like, I saw the broken shard but did not place it, became, I saw the weapon. A pattern of deliberate oversimplification. He filed a note. It disappeared. The defense attorney barely glanced at it. The judge seemed disinterested. So Nickon began archiving his own copies, separate and unflagged. Unofficial. Private. Dangerous. Kais Var was 10 years old and far too silent for his age. He sat in the waiting room outside the court chambers every day, legs swinging, holding a sketchpad and a piece of driftwood shaped like a star. Nickon approached him on the 3rd day, carrying 2 cups of warm alkaroot brew. The guards allowed him through. Can I sit? Nickon asked. Kais nodded. The boy's drawing was a garden. Not a childish one, but detailed, rows of flora, a glass dome, sunlight streaming in from angles that showed knowledge of real structures. Is this home? Nickon asked. No, Kais replied. It's what Mama sees when she closes her eyes. Nickon sipped his drink. Kais glanced up at him. Did they already decide? He asked. Nicken frowned. What do you mean? Grown-ups already know what they want to believe. They're just waiting for someone to say it loud so they can nod. The boy's face was too calm for his words. Too still. I told them Arvian came that day. Fixed the sink. He wrote in the log. I showed them. They said it wasn't enough. Arvian? Nicken asked. He was in our house. He saw Mama leave before the sun moved to the west wall. That's before the neighbor died. Arvian saw. He even waved. Do you know his full name? I wrote it, Kais said, pulling a slip of wood from his pocket. Carved into it was Arvian Nalta. 3rd Quadrant Waterworks. Service log, 1148 to 1226. The date matched the timeline. Nicken stared at it. No one took this? He asked. They laughed. Said wood doesn't count as proof. Nicken's mouth felt dry. But his mind had already started moving. That night, he accessed the municipal water service logs. It took a few reroutes through outdated firewalls and a friend in the archival branch, but he found it. Work order, #N94315, Arvian Nalta, service address, Celine Var, Quadrant 3, Unit 214. Time logged, 11:44 to 12:28. The neighbor's body had been discovered at 12:40. The time of death estimated as between 12:15 and 12:35. If Celine had been seen leaving before Arvian's exit, she couldn't have done it. But the logs hadn't been included in the court record. Because they weren't subpoenaed. Because no one had asked. Except a 10-year-old boy carving memories into wood. The fourth and final day of trial opened with cold air and closed hearts. Nicken walked into the courtroom with a sealed folder and a silent prayer. When the judge began her final summary, Nicken stepped forward. Apologies, Your Honor, he said carefully. I request temporary stay on sentencing, under Article 9, subsection 8 of the Translator's Protective Clause. The room hushed. On what grounds? The judge asked coolly. Evidence previously omitted from review that directly contradicts the timeline. He handed her the folder. She opened it. Read the first page. Her eyebrows lifted, slightly. Then she read the second. And the third. Why was this not submitted before? She asked. The defense was uninterested in pursuing the boy's claim, Nicken replied. The judge turned to the attorney, who looked paler than moments before. Call a recess, she ordered. We will reconvene this evening. Celine stood alone in her cell as the sun angled through the barred window. Nicken came to her again. She looked at him, questioning. You may not die today, he said simply. Celine exhaled, barely. Thank you, she murmured. Don't thank me yet, Nicken replied. Truth is often unwelcome. She stepped closer to the partition. Why did you believe me? I didn't, he said, voice low. I believed your son. She smiled, tired, soft, but real. He's always been braver than me. Nicken hesitated. What will you do, if they let you go? Go back to painting. Maybe on stone this time. It's harder to erase. Then, very softly. Would you like to see? He swallowed. Yes. The judge's ruling came at dusk. The sentence was vacated. No formal apology. No press coverage. Just a note in the official record, new evidence introduced, insufficient for conviction, defendant released. Outside, in the hallway, Kais was waiting. When Celine stepped through the doors, her son ran into her arms, silent tears falling down his cheeks. Nicken stood a few paces away. She looked at him. Walked over. And pressed something into his palm. A single pane of glass. Painted with a blue bloom. For when you forget that belief matters, she said. And then she and her son walked away, hand in hand, into the gold-washed light. Nicken stayed behind. Watching. Not because he had nowhere else to go. But because for the first time in years, he wanted to follow. 3 weeks passed since Celine Var had been released. No charges. No sentence. And no apology. She didn't ask for one. Back in her modest home at the edge of the river district, she reopened the windows. Washed every cup and curtain by hand. Burned the old linens in the small clay stove her father had built when she was young. Her glass tools, packed away and untouched, waited in silence. Kai's, once solemn and still, had begun humming again. Mostly in the mornings. Always that same old tune about frogs on lily pads. But Celine didn't paint. Not yet. Something in her hands still trembled, not visibly, but deeply, like roots stirred in the wrong season. Nicken Travers returned to his official translator duties, quietly reassigned to lower priority hearings. The court, it seemed, did not like reminders of its fallibility. He didn't mind. His mind, lately, wasn't in the courtroom. Instead, it lingered on a glass bloom, the one she had handed him in the hallway, blue petals kissed with gold. He had placed it on his desk at home, beside the only other item that ever mattered, a photo of his younger sister, long past, her laughter frozen in time. Celine's flower caught the sunlight through his window each morning. And every time it did, he felt something he wasn't ready to name. He hadn't seen Celine since the day she walked out with her son. He told himself that was for the best. He lied. Kai's Var had ideas. You should come for tea, he told Nicken one afternoon when the translator passed him on the street near the riverside. Should I? Nicken asked, amused. Do you drink tea? Mama does, Kai said, with the kind of shrug that meant obviously. I just chew on the roots. Tastes like wood and lightning. Nicken laughed, a sound that startled even himself. I don't think your mother wants visitors, he said. She doesn't want silence either, Kais replied, walking off without waiting for a response. 2 days later, Nicken showed up at their door with a pouch of steeped carder root and a basket of herb flat bread from the market. Celine answered the door barefoot, sleeves rolled, hair loosely tied back. She stared at him for a moment. Then stepped aside without a word. The house was warm, quiet. Not in the sterile way of hospitals or courts, but in the way of places that have endured loss and dared to be lived in again. You didn't have to come, Celine said, placing 2 cups on the table. I know, he replied, settling into the low wooden stool. But Kai said you hate silence. He talks too much for a boy who never spoke during my hearings. He was waiting. For what? Nicken looked at her. Someone to listen. Her hands paused mid-pour. Then resumed. The tea was rich and bitter with a sweetness that bloomed slowly, like everything else she touched. They didn't speak much during the first cup. But when Nicken handed her the small cloth-wrapped bundle, a replacement brush he'd found at a craftsman's stall, she ran her fingers over the bristles like they were something sacred. You kept painting after, she asked him. He shook his head. I kept recording. Why? I don't trust memory. It forgets what hurts too easily. Celine nodded. Or what matters? A silence fell between them. But this one was gentler. Not empty. Not accusing. Just, present. Days turned into a rhythm. Nicken stopped by once a week. Sometimes with tea. Sometimes just to help Kais with old language puzzles. The boy had a sharp mind, a patient ear, and a tendency to build metaphors from weather. The court was like cold rain, he said once. You get used to being wet. But it's still uncomfortable. Celine heard him from the next room and didn't interrupt. Instead, she returned to her studio. She began painting again, quietly, slowly. She didn't share her pieces yet. But Nicken saw the colors return to her fingertips. One night, a sudden thunderstorm caught them off guard. Nicken had stopped by with a broken datapad he needed help decrypting. Kais had offered to help, only to fall asleep halfway through decoding a poetry archive. Celine stood by the window, watching the rain slice through the night in silver veins. "You can stay," she said, not looking at him. "It's too rough to walk." Nicken hesitated. "I don't want to impose." "You're not." He watched her for a long moment. Then nodded. "I'll sleep in the chair." She smiled. "You always think in rules." "You don't." "I've lived long enough to know that most rules were written by people who feared the wrong things." She turned. And in her eyes, no longer dulled by grief, was something quiet, cautious, and unmistakably alive. He didn't sleep in the chair. He slept on the floor. But when he woke, it was to find her curled nearby, vines brushing against the rug like whispers. She hadn't touched him. But she hadn't kept distance either. In the new morning, nothing was said. But everything had changed. A week later, they kissed. Not under stars. Not after a grand declaration. They were in the studio. She was painting a bloom. He was reading old documents aloud, translating for fun. He said a word she hadn't heard in years, Solovrin, meaning, to find warmth in a shadow not your own. She looked at him. And kissed him. Softly. Briefly. But with certainty. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "Is this allowed?" he asked. She smiled. "Rules are written by people who fear the wrong things." They became something. Not loudly. Not with titles or promises. But in the way they moved, closer, gentler, rooted. He brought her blank canvases. She left petals in his coat pocket. Kais caught them kissing once in the kitchen and said, "You're very bad at secrets." They laughed. But it wasn't a joke. It was a beginning. Then the letter came. A state review. Request for reconsideration of her status. A clause that had not been dismissed. They wanted to reevaluate her for relocation, calling her presence publicly sensitive. No formal charges. Just removal. Displacement. Again. Nicken crushed the letter in his fist. Celine read it with no expression. "They want you gone," he said. "They always did. Then we won't let them." She looked at him then. And for the first time, he saw fear not just in her hands, but behind her eyes. "What if it happens again?" "Then we make noise this time," he said. "You hate noise." "I'd rather scream than bury you." Her lips trembled. Not from sadness. But from something more dangerous. Hope. That night, they didn't sleep separately. And this time, when she reached for him, he reached back with both hands. And held on. Not as a rescuer. Not as a protector. But as someone who had finally, irrevocably, rooted himself into her life. Together. In silence. In bloom. In defiance. The morning after the letter, Celine stood in her garden barefoot, her hair still damp from sleep, holding a mug of leaf syrup tea that had gone cold in her hands. Nicken watched her from the doorway. She wasn't crying. Not trembling. Not visibly shaken. But her vines, normally loose and resting against her skin, had wrapped tight around her arms, braided in a way they hadn't since her trial. A defense mechanism. Quiet, protective. "They're not going to take you," he said softly. "You don't know that." "Then I'll make it so." Celine turned. "I'm tired of being someone others have to defend. I want to just exist. Not survive. Then let's make that the new fight." She stared at him a moment longer. Then stepped into his arms without a word. He held her. Not to fix anything. Just to say, you don't have to carry this alone. The state's letter had come from an administrative dome in Arlench, a cold bureaucratic city where the sky always looked filtered, like someone forgot to turn up the color. It was the kind of place that cared more about compliance than people. Nikken booked a passage within the week. They won't listen to you, Celine said, wrapping food for him in travel waxcloth. They've made up their minds. Then I'll unmake them, he said, not smiling. Before he left, Kais handed him a folded sketch. This is what our home looks like, the boy said. Just in case they try to say it's not worth keeping. Nikken looked at the drawing. A house made of roots and light. 3 figures at the center. None of them alone. Arlench was worse than he remembered. Machines lined the streets, dust never settled, and the scent of dried synthetics clung to everything. He entered the review chamber through a long gray corridor that smelled like silence and sterilization. He faced 3 officials. None looked at him when he entered. You've submitted a claim under Clause 7F, cohabitation rights. Correct. And you reside with Celine Var, formerly state suspect number 3 to 149, case vacated but not expunged? Yes. And you are aware that your personal and professional reputation may be subject to audit as a result? Nikken didn't blink. I am. Then we'll begin. They asked questions for 2 hours. About Celine. About her past. Her child. About Nikken's relationship to her. You're not bonded, one official pointed out. No formal record. No registration. We aren't a form, he replied quietly. We're a family. That seemed to irritate them more. After the questioning, they handed him a new document. A conditional relocation offer. They would assign Celine to a border farming station. Safer. Less visible. She could take her son. Nikken was not included. This is mercy, the senior official said. We're offering her a fresh start. Nikken held the document for a long moment. Then tore it neatly in half. She already started, he said. He left before they could answer. When he returned, Celine was on the roof, painting light across a shattered pane, trying to make it beautiful again. He sat beside her without a word. Handed her the torn paper. She read the pieces. Didn't smile. Just nodded. So now what? Now we prepare for them not to give up. We. He looked at her. Yes. We. That night, for the first time since they met, Celine spoke about before. He died in spring, she said, curled beside Nikken under a thin moss light. Kaisa's father. Not by war. Not by sickness. Just, didn't wake up. Her voice was low. Controlled. But heavy. We had planted new vines that week. His idea. He said we needed beauty in our diet. He was always saying things like that. Nikken waited. When they told me he was gone, I didn't believe them. I kept setting a second plate. Folding his coat. Waiting for a door that wouldn't open. She looked up at him. Grief makes you quiet. And in silence, people forget you're still there. Nikken took her hand. Gently. Slowly. Her vines unwrapped themselves, slid against his wrist. Not binding. Just resting. You never forget someone like him, she whispered. You're not supposed to, Nikken said. And you're not replacing him. You're choosing again. Her breath caught. Do you think that's allowed? He smiled, just faintly. Only by people who believe in second blooms. They slept close that night. No distance. No questions. In the following weeks, the state pushed harder. They sent drones. Inspections. Requests masked as wellness checks. One morning, Kai's found a tracker hidden beneath the solar panel. Nikken removed it. Burned it. They'll keep coming, Celine said, voice flat. Then we make it a garden they can't walk through, Nikken answered. They began restoring the old biodome, once used for abandoned seedlings and weather experiments. Celine filled it with vines. Painted the walls with scenes of roots and stars. Kai's installed makeshift alarms. And Nikken, who had once only known how to listen, began speaking. He recorded their days. Documented the revival of a life the state wanted erased. If they won't see her as a person, he told a journalist friend on a coded call, then we'll show them what they're trying to silence. The article went out. The pedal beneath the gavel was the headline. It told her story. In her own words. Translated with care. With reverence. With truth. Within hours, the dome's inbox overflowed. Letters. Messages. Support. Protest. And one anonymous note. They will not take what grows in truth. Let them come. We are watching. That evening, Celine sat on the floor with the pages in her lap. I thought no one cared, she whispered. They didn't know how, Nikken said. And now? Now they see. She touched his face. Traced the line of his jaw. Then leaned forward and kissed him, not gently this time, but fully, like roots wrapping tight in fertile soil. His hands slid to her waist, anchoring. Her breath caught. And then steadied. They made love that night with no fear. Not to forget the world. But to honor it. To honor survival. To honor softness after steel. Afterward, as they lay beneath the moss-light glow, Celine whispered. I'm scared. Nikken kissed her shoulder. Me too. I don't want to lose this. Then we hold it. Even if we're trembling. She turned to him, hair falling over her eyes. Do you love me? He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, really looked. Then placed her hand on his chest. Every word I never said before you was a lie waiting to be rewritten. She blinked fast. Then smiled. Not wide. But deep. Outside, the night wind whispered through the vines. The biodome pulsed with quiet life. And in the shelter of memory, of touch, of truth. Two people. Both fractured. Both healing. Began to speak a new language. The language of soil. Of stars. And of love. Rooted not in what they had lost. But what they had chosen to grow. Together. The first explosion was small. Not a bomb. Not fire. Just glass. Shattered. The morning was calm. Kai's was feeding the lizard frogs in the garden dome. Celine was smoothing fresh pigment over a stretched pane. Nikken was fixing a solar connector along the south wall. Then came the sound, like a crystal falling, but multiplied 1,000 times. It was the back window of the studio. Cracked from heat expansion, weakened over time. But it wasn't time that finished the job. It was pressure. From outside. From them. The state had arrived. Not a drone. Not a letter. A transport unit. Quiet, unmarked, but unmistakable. It settled at the base of the hill like a shadow pretending to be a cloud. No flags. No warning. Just silence. The kind that comes before a verdict. Inside, Nikken said, calmly but urgently, ushering Kai's into the biodome. Don't argue. Now. Celine didn't move right away. Her fingers clenched around her brush, knuckles white. We've done nothing wrong, she whispered. That's never stopped them, he replied. He placed one hand on her wrist, steadying her. We're not running, he said. We're retreating. Different words. Different meanings. Her jaw worked silently. Then she nodded. They gathered what they could. Supplies. Data crystals. Kaisa's sketches. Celine's petals, still drying on pressed cloth. They didn't speak of the studio. The home. The glass. They didn't have to. The biodome had a back tunnel, once used for water runoff, now repurposed for emergency passage. Kais had cleared it months ago, just in case, he'd said. In stories, the back door always matters. It did now. They slipped through. Roots curling around their boots. Dirt soft beneath fingers. The sun behind them like a judge that refused to close its eyes. From the ridge above, they watched the soldiers step inside the house. One of them emerged a moment later, holding a painted pane. The blue bloom. The one Celine had made for Nikken. They dropped it. Stepped on it. Celine flinched. Nikken didn't speak. He just wrapped his arms around her. And held her until her vines loosened again. They ran. Not far. Not fast. But far enough to vanish from sensors. The state couldn't scan through old Terra caves, too much interference from magnetic or veins. Locals avoided them. Too dark. Too unstable. Which made them perfect. A place where no one looked. A place full of shadows. But for once, the darkness wasn't the enemy. It was protection. The first night, they lit no fire. Kais curled beside his mother, her cloak wrapped around them both. Nikken sat watch. One hand always on the hilt of the comm scanner. No one spoke. Not until dawn. When the scanner finally died with a small chime. "We're not being followed," he said. And something like air returned to the cave. They lived like this for days. 4 weeks. The cave became something else. A haven. A heartbeat. A new beginning. Celine painted again, on the walls, using crushed roots and moss oils. Kais made chalk maps. Nikken taught them old star names. In the dark, they found light. And in that light, love didn't vanish. It deepened. But peace, as ever, was temporary. One afternoon, while fetching water from a narrow spring crack, Nikken spotted movement in the tree line below. Not uniforms. Cameras. Drones, floating quiet. Recording. He didn't go back immediately. He ran a wide circle, approaching from the east, careful not to reveal their position. When he returned to the cave, he knelt beside Celine and Kais and simply said, "They found us." Celine looked up. Not with fear. But with decision. "Then we don't wait. You want to move again?" She shook her head. "No." She stood. Unwrapped a folded cloth. Inside, the last full blossom from her vine. Vivid pink and violet, pulsing faintly with bioluminescence. She handed it to Nikken. "This is proof." He frowned. "Of what?" "Of what they want to erase. What they'll never understand." "And what do we do with it?" She looked at Kais. "We show it." They emerged at dawn, climbing to the summit ridge just as the light crested the mountains. Kais held a signal flare. Nikken carried the data crystal. Celine stood between them, her vines trailing softly over the rocks like roots searching for home. They activated the beacon. Within minutes, the drones returned. This time, they didn't hide. Nikken uploaded the data stream, her art, her voice, her story. Raw and unedited. Every panel. Every painting. Every word he had ever recorded. Then he activated the live feed. "To whoever is watching," he said, staring into the lens, "this is not a fugitive. This is not a threat. This is a woman who dared to survive what the state forgot." Celine stepped forward. Said only one sentence. We are not breaking laws. We are planting roots. They waited. The reply came not from a drone, but from the sky. A large craft, civilian marked, descended slowly. It bore no insignia. Just a voice broadcast across the ridge. We saw what you showed. We're not with them. We're with you. They didn't ask questions. They didn't demand names. They opened their ramp and waited. The family boarded together. And never looked back. From above, verdant edge looked small. A patch of green trying to breathe in a world of gray. But Celine didn't weep. Nicken stood beside her, one hand resting on the back of Kaisa's shoulder. He watched her. Watched as her vines began to bloom again. Bright. Unafraid. They didn't know where they were going. But it wasn't ruin. It wasn't silence. And it wasn't alone. In the quiet hum of flight, Celine reached into her satchel. Unwrapped the last pane of glass she had saved. A painting of 3 hands intertwined. A woman's. A man's. And a child's. Beneath it, etched in faint gold. We twist. But we hold. Nicken touched the edge. She turned to him, finally speaking. You still think this was a retreat? No, he said softly. This was the bloom.